after like an amazing day. I have like so many thoughts swirling in my head. So just to frame this session, very briefly, thinking about child health equity, of course, we've heard a lot about the complexity, in terms of all the different factors that relate to whether or not children thrive, many different, both around children, their families, communities, also different sectors of services, policy. We've had great sessions, I think, today around engagement with communities, engagement with policy people. And this is really, this last piece is really around some of the data that can support this. And so while we have an international panel, we certainly, and for those of you who heard Marnie speak before, we have some great examples in Canada where there are data that from many different sectors that come together and have been used like in incredibly powerful ways around equity. But we did want to bring together, a panel to speak about some really, I would say, sort of cutting edge, slightly different approaches to data infrastructures that can help both support the research, evaluation, and potentially even sort of surveillance and monitoring for government from a few other sort of leading jurisdictions, led by our three distinguished panels. So they did not want me to go into full biographies, and you have them. But just to say, besides being very distinguished academics, have also, all three have really, led very, very large initiatives that enable, a lot of both research and policy evaluation. So we're going to start each of the panelists, so starting with John, and then Sharon, and then Ruth are going to speak about 8 minutes, I think, and then we would like to open this up for questions afterwards. I may take chair prerogative and ask the first one, but really, as they're speaking, there will be an opportunity to ask questions. The only thing I've been reminded, apparently the last couple of rows, the microphones don't work. So if you're up there and would like to ask a question, you may just need to either really yell or come down. And the only other thing I would just say, having just been in the last session, when you ask a question, I think it's okay to take your mask off. It's the sound is really tough, the combination of the mics and the mask. So feel free to unmask just to ask questions. So with that, I will pass it on to John.
Thank you, Astrid. We decided we have 3 different sized cohorts to talk about. So this is like Goldilocks, Astrid, and the 3 bears. And I'm baby bear, because I've got the smallest cohort. You're just going to have to look around. Oh. And I'm going to talk about Born in Bradford, which is a cohort that's been running for the last 15 years. This is Bradford. It's a city in the north of England in Yorkshire. Full of Victorian splendor. It was a sort of powerhouse of the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century, surrounded by the Wuthering Heights of Brontean moors. But like a lot of post-industrial cities, has a malaise. And with that comes more deprivation and more challenges and more inequalities. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the cohort and some reflections, some personal reflections about how we could improve equity in that. The first one is when you're doing research, do it in the places which need it the most. And historically, we haven't been very good at that. In the UK, we're starting to get better over the last few years, but researchers tended to stay in the big academic centres rather than the places that actually need it. So that's a sort of national commissioning thing about putting research where it's most needed. Bradford was one of these places where one of the poorest cities in the UK with some of the highest rates of ill health, lowest healthy life expectancy, yet had very little research. So when we set up Born in Bradford in 2007, it was really to try and transform it, to try and provide a catalyst for research to drive our understanding about what the health issues were. So the cohorts Started off with about 14,000 children, about 13,000 mums, some mums had more than one child, and about 4,000 dads. Dads are harder to reach. About half the cohort are white European heritage, mostly white British, but some Eastern European. And the other half are mostly South Asian, mostly Pakistani Mirpuri, so it's quite a homogenous Pakistani population. 70%, and this is across all ethnic groups, are from the poorest 20% in England and Wales. So this is a very deprived but diverse group. And one of the key things when we started, we didn't have very much money when we started, was the importance of involving our families and participants. And that involvement is really crucial. So that's my second reflection, is about involving, and I know this is the obvious, but that co-production is really important and something we've got better at over the years. I think we were quite naive to start with, but to try and get that people-powered research was really critical. I think we're more sophisticated now. You know, this is a long-term venture, and having that sustainability is really important rather than short-term projects. Agency in our families is really important, so changing the dynamics between the researcher and the participants. But also reciprocity, and our subtitle for Born in Bradford is Research That Changes a City. We want our research to be impactful, so, you know, you said we did type stuff. So over the years, the study's produced many stones on the mountain of knowledge. When we started, it was more of a clinical focus. You know, we were based in a hospital. It was inevitably focused on the clinical side, and then the omics and the genomics and metabolomics and that sort of stuff. We sort of started moving more towards the lifestyles, and you know, as we matured. With that comes, you know, the usual structural inequalities around individual behaviours and blaming people. So over recent years, we've moved more towards wider determinants, and that's my third reflection, how important it is not funding just where the research is, but also the type of research. So 90% of our health is down to these wider determinants. Health services have a very small part in our health, maybe 10%. But paradoxically, research tends to fund that sexy 10%, the biomedical side, rather than the important wider determinants and prevention side. So there's a bit about how we change what we do in terms of commissioning research away from the biomedical. So what's affecting our children isn't the hospital or clinical services. It's the houses that they live in, it's how damp they are, how overcrowded, it's the streets that they play in, how many cars are speeding past, how much air pollution. It's the green space that they can play in, the quality of that green space, access to that green space. It's the food swamps of fast food outlets and the food deserts of healthy food choices. It's about the crime and safety of the streets. It's about the schools, and we talked a lot yesterday in our session with Sharon and Ruth and Mary about the importance of schools. It's really critical to us. So this is a multifactorial, multi-exposure, complex system approach, and if we're really going to be serious about tackling inequalities, that's where we need to shift our gaze to, is tackling these wider systemic determinants. And so in our evolution in Born in Bradford, we've grown a number of cohorts on the back of Born in Bradford. We've got about 60,000 Bradfordians involved in the study now, in experimental cohorts, in genetic cohorts, in sort of routine data linkage cohorts. But more than that, we wanted to see if we could change our city into a test bed for innovation. And this is the reciprocity. How can we actually turn our research into something that makes a difference? And so this idea of a city collaboratory, I talked about Jane Jacobs, who used to live just up the road, one of the great urban activists. Fantastic. She, you know, her idea of cities as being laboratories for change. And so our approach is we need to do this in collaboration with our communities, a city co-laboratory, recognizing that there are multiple determinants, whether that's housing, urban design, or schools, and recognizing that we need a different interdisciplinary team to do this. So bringing in all the housing experts and the urban designers and the educational experts to work with us from a health perspective. So building a different consortium of interdisciplinary research and then wrapping that in robust methodological approaches. So using our epidemiology to identify risk factors, to shape our interventions that we're developing, using modeling, developing intervention evaluation, and feeding that back into a virtuous loop. So we're starting to do that now, using our epidemiological evidence to turn into interventions in multiple ways, and across neighborhoods, across schools, across livelihoods, and our food systems, and on our play systems. I think one of the lessons for us has been that, I think we had this idea of just using the evidence that we produce to develop interventions and then to add those on. But we're working on this vast, billion-pound economy of where people are funding good, intuitively good stuff to improve physical health or mental health. So we're also trying to change that dynamic with our policymakers and our commissioners. So rather than just working in our own environment, we're shaping what our policymakers are doing. And that means sitting at the senior leaders table on a week-by-week basis, informing them and challenging them. So our teenagers our cohort are now in their teenage years. So we're at this sort of exciting phase. In the early years, it was all about the importance of the early years to our physical and mental health. But we know more and more about how adolescence is also a pretty critical period, particularly after the pandemic and the impact on these adolescents, with a particular focus on mental health. So we're working now with our teenagers, 14,000 of them. We're going to open it up to every teenager in the city, all 38 high schools. So it'll be about 30,000 adolescents. It'll be one of the biggest studies of adolescence in the world. But fundamentally, when you've got and this is my last reflection, when you've got a deprived population, only 40% of our 16-year-olds at their first major exam get passes in English and maths. Only 40% of these teenagers. And if we're going to really make a difference in terms of equality, we've got to change that. So our next goal is to try and inspire our 30,000 teenagers with the joy of science. Citizen scientists, can we inspire them? Can we nurture them? Can we really make a difference for their aspirations, for their educational attainment? So my last reflection is about the pipeline of researchers and how we grow that from communities who need better representation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I've been to Bradford, and those beautiful, beautiful photos that John showed, they're just everywhere. They've had a photographer in residence, I think, artist in residence, and just magnificent photos. So John's just shared with you, the wonderful journey of Born in Bradford that's so sophisticated, isn't it? So I want to share with you now Generation V, or Gen V as we call it, we're still really on a journey. But before I do, we also in Australia come from a country where we have very similar Aboriginal both strengths and challenges, just like in this country. So as a visitor to your country, I also want to acknowledge the land that I'm standing on and pay my respects to Aboriginal people, both here in the room today and leaders of the past and emerging. And this is a beautiful painting by a local Aboriginal woman in Victoria, a Yorta Yorta woman. So just in case you were wondering where Australia was, there it is. And I'm particularly talking about Victoria, which is the bit that you can see down the bottom. And so Gen V is Gen Victoria. So that's what I'm going to be talking to you about. So I don't know if any of you recognise this picture. It is from the James Webb Telescope. And we sort of think of ourselves as building the equivalent of the James Webb Telescope. One of the greatest frustrations I have as a population health researcher is that we never have any bloody machines. So, when everyone comes to the Institute and wants to see what we're doing in population, what am I going to show them? The computer I'm working on? So one of the exciting things about Gen V is that we really are building a machine. And just like the James Webb Telescope is this extraordinary machine that's kind of gone out into space to answer extraordinary questions for mankind and sending lots of data back for researchers to use for decades to come. That's kind of how we see Gen V. And we've obviously got some great aspirations about it being able to generate the sort of data that will really help all children thrive. But just some sobering ideas for us, and part of the reason why we think these sort of data are so important. I think most of you will know this, that for the first time in the history, this generation will not live longer than the generation beforehand. And of course, that's socially patterned. And I think it's a point in time for us to say, what are we going to do now that's going to make a difference for this generation growing up? And there are two opportunities that Gen V provides, and I'll give you the scope of Gen V in a moment, but essentially there are these two opportunities. One is the early childhood opportunity from prenatal, and the other is the early adult or the early middle age, I guess, depending on what you want to talk about. But this idea of before we really hit the huge lump in chronic disease, but in fact that earlier time when we can intervene. So Gen V is recruiting babies and their parents at that really critical point for intervention. I have to get closer now because I can't read my slides. So Gen V came around as part of this kind of big idea. We had this big idea because, you know, we all know the kind of 17 years thing from research to translation, and we said, what do we need to do to kind of speed that up? What do we need to do because we're already collecting so much data but not really using it? And what do we do because we've got these complex problems, these inequities right now, and we need to do something right now? And that's kind of how Gen V was born. And this is the aspiration, this idea of how do we solve the complex problems for children and the adults they'll become. So I want to share with you a little bit of the Gen V journey. So this is a little bit of a complex slide, but I want to highlight one bit in particular. So note to self, try not to do a whole of state scale up of a cohort during a pandemic. So we did all of this. So the way we collect data in Gen V is we actually have recruiters in every single birthing hospital in Victoria approaching women giving birth and recruiting them into the study. And we can have a whole conversation about the sort of social contract you need to be able to walk into hospitals and have that sort of relationship so that you can recruit families, and maybe that'll come up later in our conversation. But as you can see, we've got this unique cohort that were actually where women were pregnant and then gave birth through pretty much every permutation and combination of COVID that you'd like. So we had lockdown, no COVID, COVID, no lockdown, vaccine, no COVID, vaccine, COVID, lockdown. We have every permutation in Melbourne. It's the biggest, most fantastic natural experiment you can imagine, just because so Melbourne had 6 lockdowns. So we have every permutation you'd like. So it's quite a unique cohort. And Gen V itself is made up of a number of building blocks. So we've got the cohort itself, which is consented. So that is, we are consenting families to come in. We've got biosamples. We're linking all of the data, any data those families come in touch with. We are collecting data and then we're embedding it for integrated studies. In other words, this is an observational and interventional platform. And we've created an IT platform which we'll use as a service to deliver data to a whole series of end users. But we have a number of guiding principles that I want to just share with you quickly, and the one I want to bring your attention to is the inclusivity principle. You know, it wouldn't be hard to go into a whole lot of hospitals and just know that we've kind of gotten a whole lot of families that, you know, speak English, that are kind of educated, and go, we've got massive sample size, good on us. But in fact, inclusivity was right at the heart of what we're trying to achieve in Gen V, that we really do have a sample that is not only large, but actually represents the population. And the other principles we can talk about later, but I really wanted to highlight that. I'll share with you a little bit of data about where we're up to. So there are more than 65,000 participants in Gen V to date. So we are 1 year into a 2-year recruitment, and that includes about 25,000 children, which for Australia makes it the largest cohort in Australia. That little dot point that says we're in all 58 birthing hospitals, that includes rural hospitals, regional hospitals and metropolitan hospitals. And if you guys, many of you guys work in a hospital, so you'll know the bureaucracy of actually getting into hospital and recruiting, like it's like 58. And I think the other thing is that, so we've got regional families, but you can see we've got families from 65 languages because we have actually translated our consent into, I think, 35 languages. So a real purpose, this is about being purposefully inclusive. And probably our greatest sigh of relief. So this is our socioeconomic index for area. So it's a geographic measure of deprivation. It's kind of the best we can do at the moment. But you can see that our Gen V population and the population of children being born in hospitals are more or less the same for the two bottom quintiles. In other words, we're kind of relieved that we are actually getting those families from those more disadvantaged areas. So very quickly, because I know we're going to run out of time, I thought I'd go through each of our building blocks. So we have the largest automated bio store in the Southern Hemisphere. So now we have a machine we can show everybody. And it's very cool. I'll just tell you a little story because for Aboriginal families, they can actually visit their blood. And that's actually quite a big deal for our Aboriginal families. So we can punch in their code and their blood will actually come down into a little sort of, where you can see that woman standing. That actually comes down to there and you can actually see it. So that's pretty cool. And you can see the samples. We've got both blood and saliva on pretty much all of our participants. We're also planning to link all data, so administrative data, non-administrative data, so hospital record data, structured data and unstructured data. So we're looking at how you can potentially get x-rays, for example, ultrasounds, etc., all into the data set. We have an app that all the families can use, so we're collecting data directly from families. So the challenge of having 65,000 participants is that you can't go and do direct assessments on anybody. So we're totally reliant on a number of different ways of getting in data, and this app will allow us to get what is often the missing piece. So you've heard about Born in Bradford, they've got a lot of outcome data. You'll hear from Ruth about the challenges of admin data. This is trying to walk the line in between having the breadth of admin data and the depth of cohort data. We're already having a lot of researchers interested, so we're already leveraging quite a lot of money, which is really great because we don't really have enough. And these are just a couple of the examples where we're doing some screening for CMV, which many of you will know is one of the causes of deafness, and we're able to follow up the vaccines of pregnant women with COVID. So already having some research use. But for me, and this is the most exciting bit for me, is the ability to get really interesting. We've talked today, haven't we, a lot about complexity. We've talked today about there are kind of no silver bullets. The reason these look like Lego blocks is because this was part of our application to Lego that we didn't get. But anyway, no sour grapes here at all. But this idea of like, can you actually stack these interventions of things that we know work and do it as a cluster randomised control trial, which you can do when you have a whole of state cohort to be able to do that. And I think this is the exciting stuff, all the things that we've been talking about today. When you have a whole of state cohort, you get to sort of think about how do we evaluate that. And then just finally, the platform is designed to be able to deliver the data to a whole series of end users. And you can see all those different end users, including not just researchers, but our collaborators, the public, policymakers, service providers. So how do you develop this platform in a way that you can come in and use that data, that we're not contravening privacy rules, but we're actually putting those data in the hands of communities. And of course, the community that we're most concerned about and want to work with is our Aboriginal communities, and how do we get data back into those communities. So this is our kind of vision that by 2035, Gen V will have helped solve the complex issues facing our children and the adults now and tomorrow. And the little highlighted bit at the bottom there is that children can't wait. So thank you.
Hello, so my name's Ruth Gilbert. I'm from University College London, and I'm involved in something called the eChild study. So eChild stands for Education and Child Health Insights from Linked Data. And this is a linked longitudinal administrative database for the whole of England. So it links all children from their hospital records, their education records, and their social care records. So on this slide, I show at the top some of the funders that have contributed and many of the team members that have worked on this, and a big shout out to Katie Harron, who's now leading the phase of enhancement and extension of eChild and widening the use beyond the UCL group to other researchers and to government. But the other two groups that are really important are, of course, the parents and young people that have helped create the need for this. So 6 years before we got any of the commissions approved by government, I'd gone to several children's charities of children with chronic conditions to talk about their needs across education for children with chronic health conditions and their experiences, so we could start writing these data and ethics applications. We're sort of building on their real experiences of the problems that these charities saw from the people that they were connected to. And we've continued that engagement. I mean, parents and young people continue to be on our steering groups and advisory groups, and we have regular sort of consultations with facilitated groups. It's becoming more and more specialised depending on the study. But I think one really clear message that those parents have given to government from their experience and that of their children is it's a no-brainer that health and education are inextricably linked. From government, yes, you see them as in different government departments, but from our experience, our health affects us in education, our education affects our health. It's an everyday experience, and that has been sort of very powerful in continuing our permissions and taking us forward to sort of enhance that data set. So what does eChild contain in a nutshell? So it's a linked database. Now let's see if this thing works. It starts with, on the right, we've got hospital data. That's something called hospital episode statistics, because we've got the NHS. So virtually 97% of all children are actually born in NHS hospitals. About 3% are born at home. Very few births happen, and very few hospital contacts happen in the private sector. So all the data comes through the NHS. Then that's been linked to data that comes from the Department for Education. That's called the National Pupil Database. It contains all of the children's records from when they go into state school, and 93% of children in any 1 year will be in state school, and 96% of children will have ever been in state school. So it is very good ascertainment. So that data includes things about their characteristics, their first language, their ethnicity, and their special educational needs in each year, their absences, their exclusions, and they are the most tested group of children, probably in Europe. We have scores that are from test results at age 5, 7, 11, used to be 14 as well, 16 and 18, and all of that is in the database. And particularly these later tests are very good sort of assessments are sort of correlated with cognitive ability and later higher education and employment and so on. The other thing that's in that database is their social care records. So whether they were referred to children's social care, I think you call it social welfare here, but it's for children with child protection concerns and disability. And we also have whether they got an intervention. We don't know exactly what that intervention was. We know whether they had a child protection procedure and whether they were in care and the number of episodes of care. So we know a lot about them. Though when at the moment we're following these children All children born from 95 onwards, so we can follow those children into their health records in their late 20s. We're extending that age back to people born from 1984, so we'll be able to follow them into their late 30s. And what we've now got approvals to add is a mother-baby link. So we'll be able to follow the school and social care records of girls, at least, not the boys, when they give birth and look at their children. And we can also look at siblings through the mother. So it's a de-identified database. We have no, we will not be re-identifying, and we're not allowed to re-identify the data. It's all held in a secure research environment run by the Office of National Statistics. It's like your stats can, and you have to have approved researcher access to get to that. So that's the database. And then I'm going to show you some examples of how we're dealing with equity. And I thought I'd first of all go from the health system to the school system. So here we've got some graphs. Sorry, I feel a bit the odd one out that I'm showing graphs today, but just bear with me. So over here on the left, oh right, that arrow works now, doesn't it? Does it? Can you see it? Yeah, there we are, the red square. So here we're looking at children by week of gestational age of birth, and we're looking at their test score results. Key stage 2 is age 11, that's age 7, key stage 1. And you can see that for every week earlier of gestational age at which they're born, they're less likely to achieve the expected scores at that key stage. So this clear gradient that you see, and then we see that at, hang on, does this work? And we see it, we've also grouped children by whether they had chronic health conditions in their health records. And you can see this steep gradient continues and is most marked and highest risk of low attainment for those with cardiovascular health problems or neurological health problems. So we see, from going from health to education, we see considerable deficits in attainment. The question we're now looking at in a study called the HOPE study, which is looking at special educational needs provision, is to see whether there's equity of provision for special educational needs for these children where we see this gradient of need, or whether it varies according to social economic status, ethnicity, and area factors. Now I'm going to show you an example going from where we've identified children with additional needs from the education and social care records. So what we've shown here, and this is for children that turned 16, and it's looking back at their secondary school history, back to the age of 11. 35% of those children in secondary school either received additional special educational needs support or social care intervention, or both. So 35%, an amazing amount. And so what we've looked at is whether the extent to which what their health needs were. And we've been looking at a particular, what we've coded up here, which is something called stress-related emergency admissions. So these are admissions to hospital, not just contact turning up at the emergency room. And these stress-related emergency admissions are very common in adolescence. They account for 1/3 of all emergency admissions. That includes injuries, sports injuries, and so on. And they're made up of unexplained symptoms, such as pain, mental health presentations, such as anxiety, depression, substance misuse, self-harm, and these, what we call other somatic disorders, such as fainting, respiratory distress, and so on. And these, indeed, were much higher in these children that receive statutory support in schools or have additional support from social care. So the next thing we'll be going on to we'd like to be going on to look at is to what extent do these children with these mental health related problems actually receive mental health care. And we're hoping to get the mental health data linked later on in 2023. But we have been able to look at how these children fare in school, and they don't fare well at all. In fact, what we've looked at is exclusionary practices and whether these children are more likely to become unenrolled. I think the phrase in North America is pushing out, or to be excluded, and these are temporary exclusions. I think you use the term suspensions here. So here's another graph. And this is the probability. So here, 10% of children, sorry, here's the thing, that about 10% of children who have special educational needs, that's the line in red, and are looked after in social care, so in out-of-home care, about 10% of them are non-enrolled, become non-enrolled in school between the age of 14 and 16. We don't know where they are. They might be homeschooled because that's not registered at all, or they might just not be receiving any education at all. So that's 10% for them, a bit lower if they don't have special educational needs but are still looked after or in contact with social care. And those at the bottom are the children with no social care, no special educational needs. So the general population, only about 2% of them. And similarly, rates of exclusions are similarly much higher for these children. So the question is, these are policies that are often based around schools, and as you'll see, also vary in local authorities. So eminently suitable for change in school practices. But these schools are struggling. I mean, they're not just sort of being punitive. What this reflects is a lack of resources to deal with these children. The other thing here you'll see on this graph, so this is the whole of England, 151 local authorities, and this is just the rates of, so the proportion of children excluded from school, either temporarily or permanently, between the ages of 14 to 16. So pretty high, 9% overall, but look at that huge variation. Each line here is at one local authority. So there's 151 lines here, and they're grouped by regions. And you can see these steep gradients across regions by local authority. So this will not be explained by individual characteristics. This is systematic differences in policy or levels of resources to deal with children that are hard to manage in schools. From an epidemiological point of view, patterns like this help to give us a natural experiment to start comparing outcomes of these sorts of practices. So I'll stop there and be ready to answer some questions. Thank you.
Thanks. Amazing talks by the, was it Three Little Bears or John, what did you say? Yes, I mean, these are like really, such interesting examples, and there's so much to unpack. Maybe I'll just start with one question. Sharon brought up the social contract and appreciating that at least the two cohorts, if I understand, would all be consented individuals. But you're also talking about linking to administrative data, and even with consent, I think there's still more to a social contract, and sort of tying it a little bit into impact and, who's driving, some of how these data have been, will be used, and then the social contract around the impact piece. So I realize that's really high up, but does anybody, or do I need to, anybody want to reflect on how that plays itself out? Again, appreciating that, John, your cohort is very mature, Sharon is enrolling, and Ruth is has done some work and continuing to link. So the sort of different stages.
So the routine data is very sensitive, but it's one of the easiest things that people consent to, actually. So we've had very few people pull the data from the routine data. You know, you get people pulling biosamples, but actually people are fairly happy to have their routine data. They sort of expect it in many ways from the NHS side. I think it's a little bit about that social contract, is how you show value or how you use it. And the advantage that Gen V has and Born in Bradford has is that we can show changes within the system. So using data to, for example, we showed evidence about air pollution and growth retardation and childhood asthma, a sort of a line of evidence that led to a very ambitious clean air zone in the city. But a lot of that was using routine data, you know, birth weight and air pollution, childhood asthma and GP attendances, and the air pollution that we're measuring. So I think there is something about how we can show value for it. One of our challenges now is with the teenagers turning 16, they become data controllers of their own data. So at the moment, they're consented by their parents. And so that's a big step. That's a big cliff for us to face. And I think that's one of the things that's geared us up more towards working out what this means for 15-year-olds, 16-year-olds to have control of the data. So they're giving their data to Facebook and Google and Instagram and TikTok. But what does it mean to have control of your own data and for us to use that? So we're going to start a series of conversations. What we'd quite like to do is get a portal or develop a portal so that both parents and the young people can choose which projects they let their data, they submit the data for. And that would be quite democratic, I think, but also keep the dialogue going about how we're using it rather than sort of something distant in the background.
And a sampling nightmare, actually, for a statistician, but that's, interesting. Sharon?
When you've got large enough samples.
Well, one of the greatest challenges for us is to create a kind of population-wide social contract that wasn't actually just for the families that were coming into the study, because that's a separate consent process, and that required a lot of training of our recruiters on how to do it safely, so that the families felt that they could say yes or no. And in fact, we get in front of about 70% of families at the moment, because sometimes they leave hospital, etc., and about half of them say, about 70% of the 70% make a decision, and about half of them say yes. So our overall recruitment rate at the moment is about 30%. But a lot of people are just not quite sure, so we're following them up. But one of our big tasks was to create a community-wide social contract that addressed things like data security. You know, there's a lot of issues about how my data might get used, about this idea of using data to make a better world for children. So we had things like billboards, we had things like focus groups who were out in the community. So all the recruiters are also in the community talking to different community groups, including Aboriginal groups and language diverse groups. So we had to create a kind of statewide contract, and including ads and things that said, being part of this is great for society, it's great for us to be involved, and it's safe for us to be involved. And we sort of had that advice from very early on that social contract was going to be really important for us to truly get an inclusive population. And I think the challenge for us has been scale. And yours is big enough scale, and then we're trying to do the whole state. And I think it costs a lot of money, and I think that it probably costs more money than we thought it was going to cost to be able to get that level of scale and that level of inclusivity. But I think without that, we were always going to get a very biased sample, and we have to obviously keep working on that.
Yeah, it's a bit different for eChild because it's routine data. So the education data has been used for 25 years. And similarly for the health data, it's just the first time this has been put together. And people do not provide consent. They can opt out of having their health data used, but that that would mean them opting out of their health data used for anything, including monitoring the sort of quality of services. So there's certainly a lot of sensitivity to showing, to having public support for this. And that's for many reasons. It's to make eChild sustainable. It's also to, it's the first ever linkage between health data and another government department in England that's been done in Wales and Scotland. So there's a lot of sort of interest in making this a success. But the other difference is that we will not be in control. So at UCL, we created the legal basis for this as a research study. But now that our ambition is, and we're in the process of doing that, we will be handing this data over to be managed by the government departments from which that data comes. And the permissions will not be under our control, it will be under their usual data sharing agreements. And a lot of it will be used by government. So the Department for Education are very keen to be using this data for their own purposes, to understand, the sort of student load that and the problems that their schools are seeing, to find ways of monitoring sort of school performance, and and perhaps things like that we might not be. League tables is a big issue in England, and so there will be questions that and uses of that data by government that people in this room might not be so keen on. I think what we have to achieve is that this is widely used, so that we have researchers and hopefully in time third sector organisations able to do their analyses on this, and so that there's a culture of critique, of reproducibility of findings, and able to critique findings, so that it's not that, like in the bad old days where only the government would have access to their data, that it's opened up to a community. And I see that as where we will have the safeguards in, with a database that is essentially not consented and is not we've started it, but is not under our control.
I was going to say, one of the things that might surprise people for us is once people consent, they consent to everything. So all their linked data and all their biological data. So we tend not to get a fallout over the biological data. And when you think that disadvantage is really a sell to society kind of issue, it's really interesting that we're going to have all of the data on these families. So it's kind of interesting when you get that social contract, what people will actually agree to sign up to.
Thanks. I'm going to open it up. We have a few, we're almost at time, but does anybody have a, go ahead.
Thank you so much for your presentations and for informing us of.
Do you want to just take your mask off? Yeah, sorry.
Okay. Thank you so much for your presentations and for informing us of some of the work that you're doing. I think throughout the day, the ethical question that's been circulating in my mind is of accountability and that challenge of being funded by government organizations, and yet the same organizations that are funding your research that you in some ways have a role to play and in advocating for that research and those findings to be used for purposes that support those participants in your research. So how do you navigate the ethical dilemma of being funded by these institutions that you are also in a position to hold accountable?
There's a couple of things to that. So we're funded by a number of organisations. So I should just say, while we're doing the actual data collection, we don't have any more access to the data than anybody else. We will just be another data user like anybody else. And we're funded by a combination of government and philanthropy. And so the data actual access will come through us. So not whereas you, I think, will come through government. The actual getting data access through us and also through the data linkage unit. So I don't feel that that's compromising. I don't feel that that's the social contract that we've got with government, but it's a really good question, which is, are the people who are funding you going to say what you can and can't use it for? But we're actually creating essentially a public asset that anybody should be able to use for whatever purpose.
Yeah, so I think all three of us will have mixed economies of funders. So a lot of our funding is charitable donations and charitable funders like Welcome and things like that. So we do have government funders through their research arms, but they are very separate and independent. And we are separate again and independent. So we have firewalls between that government sponsoring and what we're actually doing. One of our challenges is working with our local government, working with our city council, which tends to be politicized. And we're working in a health service and a health system where we have a lot of trust. It's tested a little bit during COVID, but there is a lot of trust in it. As we move over to local government, there's less trust in local government. And there's a tension there about, do we put off some of our participants when we start engaging with local government? So that's been one of our challenges.
Yeah, if I can say, one of the really good things about our funders, so our major funder, which is the Administrative Data Research UK, which is a government research funder, is that they're making this data available free. When you use health data, it's quite costly. I mean, that's common in many countries, but this linked data will, at least for the next few years, be free. And so part of our job is to increase the use by researchers. So it's that diversity of use will stop the sort of narrow interest in what it's used for, and also provide a challenge to findings from others. So I think that's what we have to do, is to increase the use as much as possible, and through that we'll have better methods, better insights, and better quality research.
Sorry, one final thing. One of the ethical issues for us is also commercial. So drug company funding. So some of our genomics, for example, is very interesting, and some of the industry wants to get involved, and we're just sort of working out how we work that relationship, because it is open access data. Our sequence data is open access, but how do we work out with industry? And if they invent a fantastic new drug on the back of somebody's rare variant, how do they benefit from it? Things like that.
Susan, I think I saw. Yeah.
Me? My question is, these cohorts are very labor intensive to generate and to maintain. How nimble are they in terms of the information they provide to make a change, such as in a COVID pandemic situation? Can you give us some examples of, because you were on the ground recruiting, for example, the Bradford cohort, did they inform pandemic policy?
Yeah, absolutely. So at the first lockdown, we turned we've got a fantastic team of epidemiologists, analysts, qualitative researchers, sociologists. We turned them completely to support our Gold Commands, citywide Gold Command, in both the pandemic response and the post-pandemic recovery. And that involves, we're able to do some of the really early modelling, some detailed epidemiological data about what was happening. And during lockdowns, when we were cut off from our families, we were able to use our contacts to do a sort of Gallup poll of what was going on, mental health, financial insecurity, and that was fed back to our senior leaders to be able to adapt policy. So it became really pivotal. And then, things like the fake news and the vaccine hesitancy from our qualitative work, we were probably the earliest in the UK to pick up some of those signals and to then develop strategies for how to deal with them. So yeah, it's a really good example. And that I think showed the value of science and evidence for our local government, actually. And since then, they're really keen to do it on a wider basis.
We were in the field, so yeah, nothing. What's your data like?
Yeah, we used our data for looking at the deficit in care for different groups with different chronic conditions, and for the social care special needs groups as well. Yeah.
Thank you.
Great. And we'll do one last question, and then, yeah, Catherine.
I will take the last question. Yes, I will. So inspiring. You're really incredible cohorts. We're a country of pilot studies here in Canada. So, but there's some really strong emerging cohorts. What advice would you have for us in terms of building the cohorts to ensure equitable sampling, to answer these big questions that are complex? Any advice that you have for us here?
Oh, an easy question. Well,
Like it. Well, my ambition in the long run would be that you'd be able to use administrative data like eChild to identify the more disadvantaged groups that you then want to sample from. And that means that ultimately you'd have to have a way of inviting people that are in the cohort from their de-identified administrative records to participate in a study. And that's been done for trials during COVID and before COVID through our NHS digital data provider. So I think that would be one way to go. And I think we're not there yet. We're still at the getting this used and adding things like the age extension and the mother-baby link. But in a couple of years, I think we need to be looking at how to bring these fantastic cohorts together, because the big weakness with our data is we only see what hits services. We don't know what is really occurring in the community or what people's views are, and that's what you have. We need to bring that together.
Yeah, I think we thought long and hard about this, and I think we're all probably converging in this view, is that I think the days of pure observational cohorts are gone. And not that they're not important, but the ability to have duality of both being observational and interventional, I think the technology we have these days will allow us to do that. And also there is just quite a lot we already know that we could actually be changing. So I think if there was this opportunity you've already got extraordinary linked data, and that will get better if your legislation. But then the question is, and I think this is the real kicker, how do you do it so that you're actually doing the ability to intervene and the ability to observe at the same time? And can you do that from just linked data? Do you need consent? Are there other interesting ways you might be able to do that? And as our digital technology is getting better and better and better, how do we sort of get that social contract with families so that we are actually considering these interventional studies? And at a community level, that's one thing, but there's also clinical trials, all sorts of other things that we can start thinking about, embedded trials, etc., where we're moving at greater speed in terms of being able to intervene, see what works when you're doing more than one thing, and look at those outcomes. And I think you may end up learning from things like ours and get even ahead of the curve. But my view is observation without intervention, I think, is probably not the way to go forward anymore. John, you want to add to that?
Yeah, not much to add. I think, target kits, I think is great, Catherine. I think you've got a great platform for developing that. I think there is something about place. So we are still a little bit fixed in the UK in terms of national cohorts. And I think that's a little bit of a 20th century model. I think place-based cohorts, you can do it nationally, but as you've done some of the work in Canada, but I think place is really important for identity and creating ownership and pride, actually. And if you can get that right, then you can really maintain and have a sustainable cohort. And then just picking on developing Sharon's point, the learning research system of what you're doing to turn research into practice, I think is a really good opportunity.
wonderful. All right, well, with that, I'm going to thank our three panelists. Very interesting discussion. You're going to join me here.